On October 16th, 1930, John Sullivan, who was with his nephew, Lawrence Sullivan, who was only 3 years old, they were driving together in the middle of the Nevada desert. They were about 150 miles away from Reno in this very remote area. John was a gold prospector, and he was heading to an area that he wanted to scout out and see if it was a proper place to prospect for gold. This area, the roads didn't even go to it. You had to drive down this road where it just kind of dead ends in the middle of the desert, right near this huge steep mountain range, at which point you needed to park your car, get out, and then walk over this hill right in front of where the road ends. And it was going to be over that hill, looking down into this valley where John wanted to prospect. So he drives down the road, he parks the car, and he turns to Lawrence and he says, "Hey, I'm going to go over this hill for a minute and check the area out. I'll be back in just a couple of minutes. Stay in here. Don't leave the car. I'll be right back." John gets out, he locks the car, he walks up to the top of the hill, and he turns around, looks at Lawrence, and waves at him. Lawrence looks up at his uncle and he waves back and he's smiling. So clear interaction. Lawrence knows where John is and where John's going. John can clearly see Lawrence. There's no one in the area too. I'm talking, this is remote as remote can be. You're just right up against this mountain. That's the only thing going on in this area. So John turns his back on Lawrence. He goes over the hill. He's now out of sight of the vehicle, and he does a short inspection of this area that he wanted to prospect. He goes back up over the hill and he sees immediately that the door is now open and Lawrence is not in the vehicle anymore. John is not immediately concerned because it's only been a couple of minutes. He can't have gone very far and there's nowhere to even go. There's no trees. I mean, basically it's just this mountain right here, but beyond the mountain, there's really nowhere to go. So he goes down, he looks in the car, he looks under the car, he's yelling for Lawrence, no response. And sound carried really well in this area. After a little while and he can't hear anything, he hasn't seen Lawrence, he's starting to get very desperate because they are in the middle of nowhere and the temperatures are going to drop well below freezing at night. So John has to make this totally painful decision to get in his car and drive and get help. And so he leaves Lawrence because he can't find him. He gets help. The sheriff comes out there and they start this massive search for this child. This whole time, John is convinced someone had to abduct him because Lawrence knew where John was. If he was to get out of the vehicle, let's say, he would have walked over the hill to where John was. John was just on the other side of the hill. It doesn't make any sense that Lawrence would get out and wander in a different direction. He would have gone to John. They were very close. He might have wanted to see what he was doing on the other side of the hill. In the first few days of the search, they can't find any tracks of the child or another person that could have potentially abducted him, or even tracks of an animal that could have potentially taken Lawrence away. There's just nothing. They did find his hat, but that was it. There's no other evidence to go off of. And so after 4 days of searching, the newspapers began running headlines about potentially an eagle swooping down and taking Lawrence away, because that's all anyone could speculate given the fact that there was no tracks anywhere and that his hat had fallen off. At this point, the police feel totally helpless. They don't understand how this child has managed to evade capture. They're not ready to accept that an eagle has taken him away. And so the police bring in a Native American tracker who was known in the area as an exceptional tracker. So this tracker comes in and manages to pick up a partial trail of this child. And he starts following it, and they get 7 miles away from where this boy went missing. And the tracker begins going up the side of this cliff. They have to actually bring in climbing equipment to get up this cliff. They go 1,400 feet up this cliff. So over 400 meters, they're going up this sheer cliff with climbing equipment. And they get all the way up there, and there's this one little shelf, this one little rocky shelf that this tracker has brought them to. And sure enough, on this shelf is Lawrence, and he's more or less unharmed. He's sleeping, but he's on this little shelf. He's tucked up against this tree. But interestingly, the tree had this bough that was fairly elastic, and it had clearly been placed over his neck, basically trapping him tight up against the mountain. It was like he had fallen into a trap, because the police said that had he moved suddenly, he would have broken his neck the way he was positioned. So the police carefully undo the branch, and they bring the boy down, which was a total task considering how far up they were. And he's unharmed. He's a couple scratches on his face, but that's about it. They have no idea how he, one, got 7 miles away and then over 400 meters up a sheer cliff, so 1,400 feet up a sheer cliff that adults needed climbing equipment to get to. And then how did you survive the below freezing temperatures? You were out here for nearly a week. Nobody knows. On October 19th, 1973, James and Carol Duffy decide they want to go camping. So they have this big RV camper and they load up their 2 kids, Jimmy, who was 2, and Natalie, who was a little over 1 year old. They load them in the RV along with their 2 cats, and they take off for Lake Wenatchee, which is in the state of Washington. It's this beautiful campsite where lots of people with RVs would park right up against this lake. So they make it to Lake Wenatchee, they park their RV, they all get out, they're going on a little walk, but the kids seem fussy, and so Carol and James decide to put them down for a nap. Carol takes the kids inside the RV, she puts them down for a nap. They're in there with the 2 cats. She shuts and locks the RV and goes outside. At this point, James says he wants to go scout for a good hunting spot around where they were camping. And so James takes off and he's looking for a place to go hunting. And Carol decides she's going to walk a little ways around the lake, but keeping an eye on the RV the whole time. And also James was within eyesight of the camper as well. And after about 15 minutes, James goes back to the camper and checks on the kids. Carol would say she saw James doing that and kind of looked over to get the thumbs up from James to make sure the kids are okay. James goes in, the kids are sleeping, the cats are sleeping. James comes out of the camper, he shuts and locks it. He turns and he sees Carol. She's about 100 meters away, so a little over 300 feet away. He gives her a thumbs up and then actually walks over to her. So he's gonna go walk around with his wife now. So he makes it over to Carol and they're walking a little bit farther away. So they're still only about 150 meters away from their camper when they hear a scream coming from their camper. When they both turned around, there was a big tree kind of obscuring their view to the camper. So they kind of ran back on the path to get a better look at their camper. And all they can see is the door to the camper is now open. So the 2 of them sprint over to the camper. James gets there first, he goes inside, and his son, Jimmy, is gone. Their youngest child, Natalie, was still sleeping, and their 2 cats were still sleeping. Remember, Carol and James were on the other side of this lake about 100 meters away when they heard this screech coming from the RV. It seems odd that the cats and Natalie wouldn't wake up to that, but they didn't. After an initial frantic search of the area where they can't find Jimmy or any sign of Jimmy, they call the police, they show up, and they begin doing a search themselves. And after 2 hours of aggressively combing this whole campsite and talking to all the other people that were there wasn't that many people there, so they were able to interview everyone, and everyone had an alibi, no one was near their camper. The police start to feel really suspicious about Carol and James. And in fact, they straight up accuse James of hurting his child and trying to cover it up. But James and Carol swear they were on the other side of the lake there, they heard that scream, they ran over, this is what we found. And so for 4 days, there's this massive search with canines, helicopters, you name it. They are combing the area, they're interviewing everyone they can. There is nothing, no sign of this child. And so the suspicion that Carol or James had something to do with the disappearance of this child only grew. And so eventually both parents were subjected to a polygraph test and both stuck to their story and both passed. They had nothing to do with the disappearance of their child. They were telling the truth. The police still felt like there's something off here about these parents. They must have had something to do with this. And so they really dug into their backgrounds and the family backgrounds, talking to friends and family. And every single person in this family's circle and even outer circle said, no, they care about their kids. They would never harm Jimmy. But through their digging, one thing that did come up is that Jimmy was actually considered a very frail child that basically couldn't do anything without assistance. So between the polygraph test that rules out the parents as being potentially responsible, and now this information that Jimmy was this very frail child who's also 2, right? He didn't get up, open the camper, escape, and then evade this massive search effort. You know, that didn't happen either. So all you're left with is abduction. But the police, they basically cordoned off this whole site and were able to account for every single person that was in the park at any time while the Duffys were there. And every single person had an alibi and completely checked out. Eventually, the search for Jimmy was terminated, and to this day, almost 50 years later, we still have no idea what happened to Jimmy, where he went, and how he got there. Late at night on March 26, 1962, the Crawford family, who lived in Tennessee, noticed their 1-year-old was sick, so they wanted to take her to the doctor's office. Mr. and Mrs. Crawford hop in the car with their 1-year-old, and they bring along their 3-year-old named Faye. They drive to the doctor's office. Turns out the 1-year-old's going to be just fine. They give the kid some medication. They head back to their house, and when they pull into the driveway, Mr. and Mrs. Crawford turn around. The 1-year-old is awake, but the 3-year-old, Faye, is fast asleep. So the parents look at each other and they say, okay, we'll get the baby inside. We'll give Faye a couple more minutes to sleep inside the car, and then we'll come out and we'll get her. So Mr. and Mrs. Crawford carefully get the 1-year-old out without waking Faye up. They shut the door, they lock it, the windows are up. They go into the house, they put their 1-year-old down, and literally maybe a couple of minutes goes by. They come out and the doors are still shut, but Faye is gone. Now, because the vehicle was still shut, they're thinking, oh, she must have gotten out of her seat and maybe is tucked under the seats. So they run over and they look inside, and Faye's nowhere to be found. She's not in the vehicle. So the vehicle itself had only 2 doors. There was 2 rows of seating, but only 2 doors. If you were in the back seat like Faye was, you would need to push down, fold down one of the 2 front seats and then open that door to get out. But both door handles on the inside were broken off. They did not work. You would have to manually roll down a window and then reach outside the car and use the outside door handle to open either door. So the parents are looking at the vehicle and the doors are shut, the windows are up, everything is still locked. And while it is possible that Faye could have, in theory, got out of her car seat, folded down one of the 2 front seats, rolled down a window, reached out, opened the door, got outside, rolled the window back up, pushed the lockdown manually, and then shut the door again, that is possible. It's extremely unlikely. And she had never done that. She'd never even gotten her own seat undone, let alone that complicated maneuver of getting out and reshutting the door and locking it. So obviously the police are called, they show up, they're searching the area, they can't find this child, and then it starts to snow and the temperatures start to drop. So the police and volunteers stay out all night. There is no sign of this child, and the Crawfords are bracing for the worst. The next day around 11 a.m., 3 miles away from where Faye went missing, she walks onto the property of someone's house. She was barefoot, but she was more or less okay. Obviously the parents are elated. They're so happy their daughter's okay. Now, normally when somebody goes missing, the investigation stays open until they're discovered. If they're discovered alive, even if the circumstances are really weird, because they're alive, it more or less ends the investigation, because what are you looking for at this point? They're found, they're alive, everything's okay. It's rare that an investigation would continue after they've been found. And in this case, the police left the investigation open because they couldn't understand how Faye could have gotten out of that vehicle, considering how difficult that would have been. And how did she get 3 miles away in less than 12 hours in the middle of the night walking through a forest? Not to mention, historically, kids are creatures of habit. If they're missing and they're in the middle of the woods, but it's nighttime, they don't just keep walking. They lay down and they go to sleep. And then when the sun comes up, they get up and then they keep moving. So for her to have gone 3 air miles from where she went missing to this farmstead, that means she did not lay down and go to sleep. She kept walking all through the night. So none of it added up. And then when they asked Faye what happened, she would just smile and laugh. That's all they could ever get out of this child. So despite leaving the investigation open, no one ever came to any sort of conclusion about how she got out of that car and how she covered that distance or why. It's just a big mystery, like all of these missing 411 cases. In 2001, Paul Wement was 37 years old. He was a construction worker living in Salt Lake City, and he was about to get divorced for the 2nd time. In his first marriage, after the divorce, he got sole custody of their 4 children. He was a great father. The judge saw it that way and said the kids were better off with him. And following this second divorce, he would file for sole custody of the child that they had had together, who was a little boy, 2 years old, named Gage, and he would win. So Paul is a single father of 5 children. Gage was a lot younger than the other 4 kids, and so he kind of became Paul's little buddy and went everywhere with Paul. They were very, very close. On October 25th, 2001, Paul takes Gage, puts him in the back of his truck, he buckles him into his car seat, and the 2 of them head off to this area where Paul would hunt for deer. It was actually a private deer hunting area that was totally enclosed by a fence. Now, in order to access this private area, you needed to be a member, and Paul was a member, and once you become a member, they give you a gate code. And so Paul and Gage drive up, he gets to the gate, he punches in the code, he opens up the gate, the 2 of them drive in. He said he shuts the gate and locks it, and the 2 of them head up this path to this area where he planned to look for some deer. When he parked the car, he saw that Gage was passed out in his car seat and just did not look like he was going to be psyched to get out and go look for deer. Paul thinks about it for a minute and he decides, you know what, I'm going to leave Gage in the back seat. I'll just shut and lock the car. He's warm, he's taken care of. I'm going to go spend just a couple of minutes looking for deer, and then I'll come back and I'll get him. So he hops out, he locks the car, and he walks a little ways away from the truck where it's still right behind him. But a couple of other hunters that were on this area, they saw Paul, they flagged him down, and they started talking. He gets preoccupied, and after 30 minutes or so, he realizes he needs to go back and check on his son. And when he goes back up, the front door on Gage's side is open, and Gage is gone. Paul runs up to the vehicle. He can't believe that Gage is gone. Paul screams for the other hunters to come over and help him. He's like, I can't find my son. They start looking in the area, and apparently Paul was so grief-stricken, he began vomiting. He was totally hysterical, and he kept saying, it's my fault. It's my fault. I left him here. Police show up, and this massive search is launched. But you got to remember that this is a gated-in area. Everything is locked. You need to have a code to get in here. And the only people that apparently were on this site at the time were the other hunters that Paul was talking to. And so obviously that casts a huge spotlight on those hunters and Paul being responsible for whatever's happened to Gage. But initially they just focus on looking for this child. And after a little bit of searching, and there's absolutely no sign of this kid, they do turn on Paul. He's like, you know what, if anything happened to my son, it's my fault. I left him in the vehicle, it's my fault. Like, he's not being defensive at all. He is 100% saying, it's my fault, I did this. He's not saying I harmed my child, but he's taking full responsibility for whatever's happened. And the police pick up on that, and they're like, you know what, I think he's telling the truth. And he's also saying that he was with those other hunters, and they're the only other ones here. So for 4 days, this massive search is launched all over this hunting area, even beyond the hunting area, and there's no sign of this child. He's just gone. And so they terminate the search, but Paul's church offered to send another 150 volunteers to continue the search. And one of those volunteers was a man by the name of James Wilkes. He was an avid outdoorsman, and he brought along his dog, Dino. And over the course of this search, James and his dog actually get lost, which David Paulides says is very rare. There's so many people doing the search at one time, it would be hard to get lost, but it does happen. And so James and his dog wind up miles away from where they were supposed to be searching. They don't know where they are, they're lost. And so that night, the temperatures are dropping, it's snowing, and James and his dog ended up getting under a tree, in this little pocket under a tree, and they huddled together all night. And James said it was one of the worst nights of his life. He didn't sleep much, but at some point in the morning when the sun started to come up, he was happy to be alive. You know, he didn't die of hypothermia. And he and Dino start walking. And they've only walked a couple of minutes when the dog stops and he starts licking something on the ground. And he looks down, and under a couple inches of snow, it's the body of Gage. James scoops up the body, and for hours they start walking back kind of generally towards where he thinks he needs to go. He ends up finding a fence that he recognized. And since he was exhausted from carrying the boy, he placed the boy's body near a fence post that he knew he'd be able to recognize. And he and Dino made their way up to the search and rescue headquarters, told them where to find the boy's body, and they went back and they collected the boy's body. Now, because James is the one to find the boy, they immediately had to treat him like a suspect. They polygraphed him because you found the boy, no one else has found him, you're ways away from the search, but he passed his polygraph. James would say to police that when he found the body, there were all these tracks around the body. They looked like canine tracks, but they weren't Dino's, and he knows they weren't Dino's because he was holding onto Dino all night, and he hadn't been in this particular area the night before. So investigators are like, if there were other canine tracks all over that area, it means, one, we searched it, but if we searched it, why didn't they pick up on the boy, who they're trained to smell? Or what animal was this? Did it have anything to do with why Gage is here in the first place? After the autopsy, it was determined that Gage died from hypothermia. His father was absolutely devastated. You know, he spent all this time at the site where his body was found. He created a shrine for his son. He was known to spend hours in his vehicle trying to figure out how his son got out of his seat and then made his way out that front door, something he had never seen his son do. He was just totally devastated, and he was ultimately charged with negligent homicide, and he pled guilty to it and was given 30 days in jail, but before his sentence was carried out, he took his own life. So like all cases that David Paulides covers in the Missing 411 series, we're left with a lot of questions, and unfortunately they may never get answered. But that doesn't stop us from speculating, so please go in the comments and give me your best theory as to what's going on. How are these kids getting outside of these vehicles and winding up in places that seem impossible to get to? Not only will I respond to all the early commenters, the best theory will get pinned at the top of the comment section. If you enjoyed today's video and you want to see more like it, please throw the like button into the bottomless pit near Ellensburg, Washington, and also please subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. If you want to get 33-year-old Barbara Mendes looked down at the blank piece of paper in front of her. Rolling the pen under her fingers across the kitchen table, Barbara wished that writing or talking about her feelings was as easy for her as it was to make a delicious dinner or to embroider a piece of clothing or fine cloth. But it was coming up on Valentine's Day, 1982, and Barbara had decided that this year she was going to give her two daughters not just cards and chocolates, but a letter that told them how much she loved them. Both the girls were at or close to the point where they were becoming teenagers. Dawn was 13 and Christy was 11. And more, Barbara could feel them beginning to pull away from their parents. Not that the girls had ever given Barbara or her husband Robin, known to everyone by his nickname Bob, any trouble, and the pulling away that Barb sensed now was not rebellious or painful. The girls were just growing up, and Barb knew from her own childhood, and now her perspective as a mom, that the time all of them were spending together now in their modest but cozy house tucked away among the woods would not last forever. Taking a deep breath, Barb stopped rolling the pen, she picked it up, she pressed the point carefully onto the paper, and she began to write. She opened with, "My daughters." 5 sentences later, and Barb was finished. Relaxing her grip on the pen, she read over what she had written. Then she put her pen down, she folded the letter, and slipped it into its envelope. But before getting up from the table and getting started on her to-do list of household, church, and work tasks that never seemed to end, Barb turned toward the window and looked out at the cold and snowy Wisconsin winter. She and Bob had lived in Minocqua, a town with 3,300 residents and only 3 traffic lights, ever since their marriage almost exactly 14 years ago on March 2nd, 1962. But even though it was so small, Minocqua was still bigger than the town where Barb had done most of her growing up. Not long after she'd been born, more than 200 miles to the south, in the bustling county seat of Manitowoc, Barb's parents had moved their family up to Boulder Junction, a tiny town of fewer than 500 people. Even if Barb's father, an aircraft mechanic who had served in the Navy during World War II, and her mother, who had stayed home to take care of Barb and her 3 sisters, had not been fairly conservative and religious people, Boulder Junction was so small that Barb might not even have heard about a lot of the cultural, political, and technological changes of the 1960s that started just a few years before Barb and Bob had gotten married. So, while other young couples in other parts of the country might be experimenting with sex, drugs, and rock and roll music, Barb and Bob had settled here in Minocqua, in their 3-bedroom house located just a half-mile away from sleepy Route 70 and the family-owned upholstery business where Bob worked. And for Barb, who was quiet and shy, this life suited her just fine, because Barb had never really needed that much anyway to make her feel grateful and blessed. Staring now at the snow-covered pine trees outside, Barb thought ahead to the arrival of spring and summer, and how she and her girls had always made the most of those 2 magical seasons, going out together to pick the berries that Barb would make into jars of fruit jellies and preserves, and enjoying the lakes that Minocqua was famous for in this part of the Northwoods. And always, as the girls got older, Barb had made a point of welcoming her daughter's friends for playdates and sleepovers, and doing everything she could to make sure that Minocqua felt less like a small town that people couldn't wait to leave, and more like the storybook version of Little House on the Prairie, where childhood was wholesome, fun, and safe. In fact, the biggest transformation in the social lives of Barb and Bob Mendes and their 2 kids had happened 3 years earlier, and it had nothing to do with popular culture and trends, and everything to do with the family's spiritual life. That was when Barb and Bob, along with a handful of other passionate believers in a conservative Christian denomination called Assemblies of God, had helped found a church of their own. Located about 8 miles west of the Mendes house, the new church had very quickly become the center of the family's social as well as spiritual life. Barb had become a Sunday school teacher, and Bob, who was more outgoing than his wife, was one of the church's youth group leaders. For all the Menendeses, church was where they formed their closest friendships. That's where Barb's older daughter, Dawn, could spend time with her best friend, Jody, whose father was one of Bob's best friends. Barb's best friend was also a very active member of the church. Sherry Anderson, whose husband, Wendell, was the pastor, was as close to a confidant as the very private and reserved Barb Mendes had. It had been with Sherry's support and encouragement that Barb had picked up a part-time job starting about a year ago, working as a teller at the Park City Credit Union, which was located roughly halfway between the Mendes home and the Assemblies of God church. And suddenly, with that job, everything Barb could have wanted was within a 10-mile radius of where she sat right now: the church where she worshipped, the bank where she worked, and the family business where Bob worked installing carpets and upholstery. Every member of her family had become well known in this community. Bob out riding his motorcycle to work with his toolkit strapped on the back, the girls going off to school each day, and Barb herself, whose friendly manner and shy but beautiful smile had made her a favorite among the members of Park City Credit Union. But right now, as Barb continued to stare out the window of her kitchen, the Valentine's Day letter in its envelope on the table in front of her, she wondered exactly when and how her life seemed to have slipped out of its perfect frame. There were the recent bank robberies in the area, practically unbelievable in a town that hadn't seen a murder since 1935, and very few violent crimes of any type. And Barb had to admit that even though only one of those robberies was still unsolved, she felt scared every time she saw a customer in the bank who behaved in any way that struck her as out of the ordinary. But Barb also knew that her real trouble lay much closer to home. In fact, she worried that it lay right inside one of her favorite places on earth, the Assemblies of God Church. And lately, when she entered the worship area that meant so much to her and that had been her place of comfort and strength, Barb was now finding excuses to slip away so she could sit by herself in one of the meeting rooms, doing her best to hold back tears. 2.5 months later, on Wednesday, April 28, 1982, Barb packed the family car in the lot right behind the Park City Credit Union, located on Highway 51 in the city of Minocqua. It was a clear, sunny day, cold in the morning, but by afternoon, the temperature was supposed to double. As Barb closed the driver's side door of the car and headed for the bank, she was glad that after the long Wisconsin winter, it was finally starting to warm up. But despite the spring weather and sunshine, when Barb walked inside into the work area of the credit union, she had to force herself to smile as she said good morning to her boss, credit union manager Helen Gray. Because the last 2 days had been hard for Barbara. 2 days earlier, on Monday the 26th, there had been an embarrassing incident at the Bible study meeting that Barb and Bob had gone to at a church member's home. And on the very next day, Tuesday, April 27th, Barb had a long phone conversation with her friend Sherry, the church pastor's wife. Barb could not bring herself to tell Sherry the real secret that weighed so heavily on Barb these days, but Barb did manage to reassure her friend that soon Barb would be taking steps to resolve the problem, and when that was done, Barb would be feeling much better. After ending that phone call, Barb had turned her attention to making dinner. But even though the Mexican food Barb had prepared, Bob's favorite, had gotten rave reviews, the evening had left Barb feeling tired, and she was still tired this morning as she counted the bills in her drawer and took her position behind the customer service counter. Then, as Helen walked across the lobby to open the bank doors for business, Barb gave herself a mental shake. Making sure her white blouse was neatly tucked into her dark skirt, Barb squared her shoulders as the first customer stepped up to her station. But by midday, Barb's workload had unexpectedly doubled. Helen, the bank manager, had started to feel sick, and by 1 p.m., she felt so bad that she and Barb had decided that Helen should just go home and let Barb finish out the day and close the bank on her own. About 4 hours after Helen had left, Barb was helping the last customer of the day, one of the members of the credit union's own board of directors, who was there to convert $55 in change into dollar bills. Even if Barb hadn't been alone for half of her shift, that Wednesday still would have felt like an unusually stressful day, because that afternoon, Barb had had a scary interaction with a customer named Thomas Bowes, who kicked up a fuss when she told him that because he wasn't a member of the credit union, she could not cash the check he had handed to her. When he came back a second time after filling out a membership card and Barb did cash the check, His irritability and the argument he got into with his brother, who was with him, made Barb wish she was not alone behind the counter. All she'd been able to think about were the 2 recent bank robberies in the area and the fact that the suspect in one of those robberies was still on the loose. Chatting now about that encounter with the credit union board member, Barb relaxed a little as she rolled the last of the coins into its paper sleeve, handed over the dollar bills in exchange, and then walked her final customer to the door. As she watched the man cross the parking lot and get into his car and wave back at her, Barb felt a rush of relief that it was finally 5 o'clock and her workday was almost over. And after locking the door behind her, Barb headed back to the office to start entering that day's transactions into the balance sheet. But Barb hardly had time to sit down, catch her breath, and pull up the credit union balance sheet to make her first few entries when she heard a knock on the front door of the building. Startled, Barb dropped her pencil and looked up. But the entrance to the bank wasn't visible from the desk where she was sitting, and the only way to see who was there knocking was to get up and walk past the service counter and out into the lobby and waiting area. Barb looked at the time. The bank had been closed for almost 15 minutes, but even as Barb was deciding whether she should go to the door and see who it was, or, still thinking about the recent bank robberies, call the police, she heard the knock again. And this time, she thought she could make out a voice she recognized. Taking her hand away from the telephone on her desk, Barb waited a few seconds for her heart to stop racing. Then the 33-year-old wife and mother of 2 stood up, made a wide loop around the counter, and headed for the front door. A little over 2.5 hours later, at close to 8 p.m. that night, the first police and emergency medical vehicles were pulling up in the parking lot outside the City Park Credit Union, sirens on and lights flashing. There to meet them was the credit union manager, Helen Gray, who had placed the 911 call to the Minocqua Police Department a few minutes earlier at 7:43 p.m. Still in a state of shock, Helen walked into the credit union with police officer Norm McMahon and led him behind the service counter to a space between one of the staff desks and the bank safe located behind the desk and against the side wall of the bank. Sprawled inside of that space, police found the brutally beaten body of Barbara Mendes. And even as Helen and the police officer stepped back to let medical technicians check for signs of life, it was clear that Barbara was dead. Her wavy shoulder-length brown hair was matted with blood, and the left side of her skull, face, and ear showed cuts and drag marks from whatever weapon had been used to kill her. From the position of her body, it looked like Barb's attacker had struck her from behind, and at some point during or after the attack, the murderer had rolled her body over so she was lying across her left arm, while her right arm, the fingers curled upward in a loose fist, was stretched out along her right side. Blood from Barbara's injuries had spread out in a wide pool around her head, too much to be fully absorbed by the thick carpet underneath her. The cash drawer at the counter where Barb had worked that day was open, and a total of what would turn out to be $2,700 was missing. The Minocqua Police Department may not have investigated a homicide in almost 50 years, but Officer McMahon's training kicked in right away. After giving directions to secure the crime scene and get crime scene techs to the bank as soon as possible, one of Officer McMahon's first calls was to Barbara's husband, Bob. It had been Bob who had called the manager of the credit union earlier that evening at 7:15 after Barb had failed to show up at church for the 7 p.m. Wednesday service. Even though Barb had called him earlier that day to say that she would be working late, she had also told Bob that she'd be home in time to pick up the girls and join him at church for the 7 p.m. service. Figuring that Helen's home was closer to the bank than the church was, Bob had asked the manager of the credit union if she would make the 1.5-mile trip to Park City Credit Union to check on Barb. Already feeling guilty that she had left Barb alone to close up the bank that evening, Helen immediately hopped into her car with her daughter and did what Bob asked her to do. And just 27 minutes later, Helen had made her gruesome discovery, and with shaking hands, she had dialed 911. But even as police were setting up a perimeter of yellow crime scene tape around the bank and arranging for Bob to identify his wife's body, investigators from both the Minocqua Police Department and the Oneida County Sheriff's Department, which had also responded to the emergency call, had already put together 2 possible theories that would explain the crime scene and Barb's murder.
The first theory was that Barb had been the tragic victim of a bank robbery gone wrong. That theory fit neatly with the fact that there had been a recent rash of robberies in the area, that the perpetrator in one of the robberies was still at large, and that approximately $2,700 was missing from Barb's cash drawer. The second theory was that the motive for the murder was personal, and that Barb's attacker had made off with the money so it would look like a robbery. This theory, that Barbara knew her attacker, would explain why there was no sign of forced entry into the credit union, why the assailant had not taken any of the $17,000 in cash that was sitting in plain sight inside the open safe just a few feet away from Barb's body, and why Barb's attacker was apparently able to walk right up behind her and strike her on the back of the head. Over the next 2 months, officers from the Minocqua and nearby Rhinelander police departments, along with the deputies from the sheriff's department, had a total of 10 investigators working more than 12 hours a day on the Barbara Mendes homicide. With other officers also donating their off-duty time to help, law enforcement would interview more than 100 witnesses, as well as follow up on a barrage of tips and rumors. They had questioned people who had transacted business at the credit union that day, as well as shoppers and store owners at the business center near the bank. They had combed the wooded areas along Highway 51 where the credit union was located, looking for a murder weapon they did not find, and they had collected as much physical evidence from the crime scene as possible without coming up with any blood samples or fingerprints that would lead them to a possible killer. But despite the hours that law enforcement had poured into this investigation, by mid-May, 6 weeks after Barb's death, police investigating both theories of the crime had hit one dead end after another. As the husband of the victim, Bob Mendes was automatically at the top of the suspect list. But Bob was also among the first suspects that police had to cross off their list. From the time Bob arrived home from work at Lakeland Upholstery at about 5 p.m. until sometime after 8 p.m. when he arrived at the Park City Credit Union, Bob could account for all his actions and whereabouts. Bob's alibi was confirmed 3 days later when they followed up their initial interviews with Bob and Barb's daughters, Dawn and Christy, with long interviews at the police station where they took down the family members' formal statements. Both Dawn and Christy, who had gotten home from school on the day of their mother's murder at about 4:20 p.m., had seen their dad come home about a half hour later, just before 5 p.m. Just after 5, their dad had passed along a phone message from their mom telling them she'd be home by 6:15 or 6:30. And since Dad would be riding his motorcycle to church that evening, Barb would drive the girls to the 7 p.m. service with her. After that phone call, Bob and the girls had a quick dinner of tacos. Dawn's best friend Jody had also spoken to Bob around 5:15 or 5:30 when she telephoned the Mendes house, and Bob had answered the phone. After that, Bob had showered, dressed, and then hopped on his 1979 Honda CX-5000 motorcycle and left for church, where church members would see him at about 6:20 p.m. But aside from confirming that Bob did not leave the church again until he got the call from police that Barb was dead, members of the Assemblies of God Church just did not seem that eager to share information about each other's lives and church politics or gossip with police. And Barb's funeral service, which was held on the same day that Christy, Dawn, and Bob were all formally interviewed, did not offer any clues about Barb's personal life either. As a few police officers watched from their seats in the back of the church, 300 mourners filled into the sanctuary of the Assemblies of God on Town Line Road. Pastor Wendell Anderson described Barb as, quote, a woman who had committed her life to the Lord, end quote, before reading some of Barb's favorite verses from the Bible. The next day, the local newspaper would quote one of Barb's friends and fellow church members as saying that Barbara's death, quote, did not fit her life in any way, end quote. And then, this friend summed up the fear that had gripped the entire town of Minocqua in the wake of Barb's murder, the first homicide the sleepy town had seen since 1935. Quote, it's all just horrible, end quote. Meanwhile, as the Minocqua Police Department started focusing its efforts on finding suspects who may have had a personal motive for killing Barb, the Oneida County Sheriff's Department was focusing more and more on the theory that Barb was a victim of a robbery gone wrong. And for them, suspect number 1 was Thomas Bowes, the argumentative man who had visited the Park City Credit Union 2 times on April 28th, the day of Barb's murder. Because, as police soon discovered, Thomas had a prior criminal conviction from 5 years earlier for committing a robbery without a weapon. And when Thomas Bowes' wife, Judith, started changing her story about her husband's activities and whereabouts on the day of Barb's murder, police zeroed in on the man at least one officer privately described as more of a, quote, goof than a danger to society. But, like all the other leads police had uncovered in the case, the Thomas Bowes lead would dry up 9 months after Barb's murder in the end of January 1983 when Thomas passed a lie detector test. And meanwhile, other leads involving other robbery suspects would also hit a dead end. But by the fall of 1982, 3 months before Thomas Bowes was crossed off the suspect list, residents of Minocqua were all talking about a different crime that had just been reported in their local newspapers. And like Barb's death, this crime also involved a member of the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road, the same church that Bob and Barb had helped found 3 years earlier. In October 1982, 6 months after Barb's murder, the church was rocked by an allegation that one of its members had been sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. The charge resulted in the perpetrator being sentenced to 4 years of probation, but the scandal also had the effect of breathing new life into the stalled investigation into Barb's murder. Law enforcement had no evidence that linked the 2 crimes, but officers decided to take another run at interviewing church members about what might have been going on in the church at or around the time that Barb was killed. They also re-interviewed Bob. Barb's husband had raised eyebrows when he'd started dating a new girlfriend earlier that fall, but when police re-interviewed him in October, nothing about his alibi or about the statements his daughters had made to police 6 months earlier had changed at all. And by the spring of 1984, 2 years after Barb had been murdered, the investigation into her death once more stuttered to a halt, and the key players in the drama were all starting to move on with their lives. On March 10th of 1984, Bob had remarried and his new wife had moved into the Mendes house where she would do her best to fill the terrible hole that Barb's death 2 years earlier had left in the lives of Barb and Bob's daughters, Dawn and Christy. Meanwhile, the sex abuse scandal at the Assemblies of God Church would fade from the headlines. The $5,500 reward for information leading to a conviction in the murder case of Barb Mendes would go unclaimed, and contributions to an educational fund for Dawn and Christy would slow to a trickle. The only other progress in the investigation would be DNA tests that cleared rather than convicted one remaining suspect in the rash of robberies that had occurred near the time of Barb's death, along with a visit to the police from a Minocqua resident who dropped off a particular tool that they thought might match the type of weapon that had been used to beat Barbara Mendes to death. So this tool that was dropped off was an example of what the murder weapon could have been, not the actual murder weapon. Investigators established the Minocqua resident's alibi. They took a picture of the tool, made a note, and filed the information away inside a case file that now included thousands of pages. And if it hadn't been for the sheer persistence and determination of Barbara's own daughters, that huge case file might never have been opened again. Because, in the course of getting on with their own adult lives, both Christy and Dawn had joined forces and become determined not to rest until they had discovered who had killed their mother. Starting back in 2002, 20 years after Barbara was murdered, Dawn, now 33 years old, and Christy, now 31 years old, began a relentless campaign aimed at getting police to reopen the investigation into their mother's death. That included writing a letter in 2016 to the producers of the true crime television show titled Cold Justice, asking them to take a look into the unsolved murder of their mother. And in February of 2017, the 2 women finally got the response they had been pleading for. 35 years after Barb's murder, and almost a year after dropping that letter off in the mail, the Cold Justice team of investigators accepted the challenge. And 1 year after that, police, with the help of the investigators from Cold Justice, finally closed in on a murderer who had eluded them for more than 3 decades. When the arrest came on February 6, 2018, nearly 36 years after Dawn and Christy first learned that their mother was dead, it was the result of an intense 2-week-long partnership between Cold Justice and the Oneida County Sheriff's Office. During those 2 weeks, the team of investigators reviewed the entire case file on the murder of Barbara Mendes from beginning to end. And after hiring a forensic weapons expert to help identify what instrument was used to kill Barb, and talking again with 3 key witnesses, as well as Barb's old church friend Sherry Anderson, wife of church pastor Wendell Anderson, police uncovered the truth about one of the most infamous murders that has ever occurred in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. Based on that investigation, here is a reconstruction of what happened to Barbara Mendes on April 28, 1982. By the time 33-year-old Barbara Mendes had closed and locked the door of the Park City Credit Union on that Wednesday evening in late April, she was physically and emotionally exhausted. She'd been thinking over the events of the last several days and about the concerns she had shared with her friend Sherry when they talked by phone just the night before. But Barbara had not told Sherry everything, and even now, knowing what Barb did, Barb wasn't sure that Sherry or anyone else at the church would really be able to understand the decision that Barb felt like she had to make. Walking back to her desk, Barb sat down and started making her first entries into that day's bank transaction record. The quicker she could get this done, the sooner she would be home with her 2 daughters, and the sooner they would all be at the 7 p.m. church service where Barb could talk again to her friend Sherry. 10 minutes later, the sudden and unexpected knock on the front door of the bank made Barb jump. Her first thought was that it might be a bank robber, and Barb felt her heart start to hammer in her chest. But as soon as Barb heard the voice that was calling to her from outside the bank, she stopped reaching for the phone to call police. This was a voice that Barb recognized, and this was a conversation that Barb knew she could no longer avoid having. Taking a deep breath, Barb pushed her chair back, stood up, and began walking towards the door. For Barb's killer, as well as for Barb, this was a moment of decision. And standing now in the shadow of the entryway to the credit union, the killer listened first to the silence inside, and then to the sound of footsteps, and then to the key turning in the lock. A moment later, and the killer was inside. The killer reached out a hand, but Barb moved away. Turning, she walked back over to her desk. She had read the Bible. She knew what the scriptures had to say about the kind of relationship she had observed and the kind of person who got involved in that sort of relationship. Their conversation did not last long. The killer had denied everything, but Barb had spent weeks watching and listening, and Barb could no longer stand by and let this relationship go on. The killer stood in front of her and bowed their head. Barb reached down and picked up the bills she had collected out of the cash drawers. Signaling that the visit was now over, Barb turned her back and took 3 steps in the direction of the open safe. All she wanted now was to end this encounter, to finish her work, and to get home to her kids. But the killer could not let that happen. As soon as Barb had turned toward the safe, the killer reached into their coat pocket to pull out the metal pry bar they had hidden there. The flat end of the tool fit comfortably in their hand. At the other end of the shaft, the claw tip bent at an angle, giving the tool the same overall shape as a short flat crowbar with flat, sharp, beveled ends. Quietly, the killer took a single long step toward Barb's back. Once they were just within striking distance, the killer raised the pry bar high over their left shoulder and then brought it down with terrible force against the back left side of Barb's skull. Once Barb had collapsed to the floor, the killer stepped over to her body. Grabbing her right arm, the killer rolled Barb onto her side so her left arm was stretched underneath her chest. Tightening their grip on the pry bar, the killer bent down and began beating Barb's head and the left side of her face, dragging the curved end of the bar again and again through her hair and skin, making ragged cuts and scratches across her cheek and tearing away part of her left ear. The autopsy that would be performed on Barb's body the next day, Thursday, April 29th, would catalog a total of at least 17 blows to Barbara's head, all resulting in extensive skull fractures. The total absence of any defensive wounds suggested that the attack took Barb completely by surprise, and the first blow was so disabling that Barb never even had a chance to fight back or protect herself in any way. Now, looking down at Barb's body, the killer rested their palms against their knees. The pry bar in the fingers of one hand glistened red in the single overhead light. Waiting to catch their breath, the killer watched as the pool of blood under Barb's head widened across the carpet. And then, standing up, the killer set about making the murder look like the scene of a robbery gone wrong. In a few fast movements, the killer had grabbed a deposit bag from Barbara's desk that contained about $2,700 in that day's transactions, leaving Barbara's cash drawer behind the service counter open and empty. Pausing just long enough to make sure they were not leaving anything behind that could reveal their identity, the killer walked to the front entrance with the pry bar and bag of cash, and then, making sure not to leave any fingerprints, the killer slipped out of the Park City Credit Union. Glancing at their watch, the killer was surprised to find that the entire encounter with Barb, ending with her death, had taken fewer than 10 minutes. Still, it was the critical window of time, part of maybe 30 minutes that police would come up with as the time the murder was committed, and the killer knew they had to find a way to place themselves during this half-hour period far away from the credit union. But the killer wasn't worried. After all, teenagers did not really pay very close attention to what time it was, and the killer knew it would be easy to manipulate and coach the people closest to him into providing him with the perfect alibi. A few minutes later, just after 5:30 p.m., Bob Mendes, Barbara's husband and killer, arrived back at the family home on Hill North Dale Road. The bloody pry bar that he had just used 15 minutes earlier to murder his wife was securely locked in the toolbox on the back of his Honda CX-5000 motorcycle. And by the morning of May 1st, 3 days after Barb's death, the most important pieces of Bob's plan to cover up for his crime fell neatly into place. When investigators brought Bob and his 2 daughters down to the police station that morning to give their formal statements about where they were and what they were doing on the evening that Barbara was murdered, the only times that the 2 devastated teenagers could seem to remember about exactly where their father was between 4:55 and 6:45 on the night of their mother's murder were the times that their father had told them. Yes, Don and Christy told investigators, their father had been home before 5 p.m. Yes, he had stayed at the house until close to 6 p.m., when he had left on his motorcycle to drive to church. And Bob still had one more important witness that he could also count on for helping him create a watertight alibi. And that person was his daughter Dawn's best friend, 14-year-old Jody, the teenager that Bob had been sexually abusing for almost an entire year. The teenager that Bob had promised to marry as soon as he could end his marriage to Barb. It would turn out that Robin Bob Mendes was not at all the good Christian and the fine husband and devoted father he pretended to be. And by February of 1982, when his wife, Barb Mendes, sat down to write a Valentine's Day letter to her 2 daughters, Barb had already begun to put together the true picture of who her husband was. Not only did Barb know that her marriage was in trouble, she had also begun to suspect that her husband was involved in an inappropriate relationship with a girl who was just barely 14 years old. And not only was this girl close friends with their own daughters, Jody was also the daughter of Bob's own best friend, as well as a member of Bob's youth group at the Assemblies of God Church on Township Road. By the spring of 1982, rumors and whispers had begun to swirl inside the church about the amount of time and attention that Bob was lavishing on Jody. And members also noticed that Bob and Barb Mendes no longer sat together at church services, and on one occasion, they had arrived in separate cars at a Bible study meeting at a member's home, with Barb looking and acting so visibly upset that everyone in the group had felt extremely uncomfortable and embarrassed. By late April, Barb had begun to confide to her friend Sherry that she was worried about the relationship between Bob and Jody, and that Barb had decided she needed to confront her husband. If he did not stop all contact with Jody and start working on his marriage, Barb had decided she was going to take her daughters and leave Bob and go stay with her own parents, who now lived out in Colorado. But Barb never had the chance to put that plan into effect and to help rescue a vulnerable teenage girl from an abusive relationship with Barb's husband. Instead, on April 28th, Bob, the only person aside from the bank manager who knew Barb would be closing the credit union alone that evening, showed up after finishing his work at Lakeland Upholstery at the Park City Credit Union. Armed with the pry bar he used almost every day and carried with him in his toolbox, Bob knocked on the locked door of the bank and called out to Barb, telling her that he needed and wanted to talk. And just a few minutes after opening the door to Bob, Barb had been beaten to death by her husband of 14 years. After Barb's murder, Jody, who had also been coached and manipulated by Bob, joined with his daughters in giving him a fake alibi. It wouldn't be until 6 months later, when police investigated allegations that Bob was sexually abusing Jody, that Jody broke down and told police that she had been lying when she said that she had talked to Bob on the Mendes house phone at about 5 p.m. on the night that Barb was killed. But laws and public perception regarding sexual abuse were a lot different in 1982 than they are today, and police were skeptical about Jody's corrected testimony. And even though Bob pled no contest to the charges and was convicted of sexual assault on a minor, he was only sentenced to 3 years of probation. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Jody was savaged in the press and by her own father for being a temptress and a slut and an adulterer. But even though Bob's now public relationship with Jody gave him a motive for wanting his wife Barb dead, he still had the perfect alibi, the one provided by his deeply traumatized daughters, Christy and Dawn. It wasn't until 2002, when the daughters were in their early 30s and started looking back over their childhood, and in particular their father's behavior after their mother was murdered, that they began to realize how obviously and completely they had been coached, manipulated, brainwashed, and used by their own father, the man who never even purchased a headstone for his dead wife and who never once took his kids to see her grave. The man who had been seen by 2 different witnesses leaving the credit union on his motorcycle during the window of time in which the murder was committed. The man who suddenly had enough cash right after that murder to buy himself an expensive new motorcycle and who painted his motorcycle helmet a different color. The man who failed a lie detector test 5 weeks after the murder of his wife. The man who not only sexually assaulted their own good friend Jody, but who would later go to prison for 8 years for sexually abusing a 5-year-old girl, and the man whose own brother would go to the Oneida County Sheriff's Department in 2002 and suggest that the murder weapon they were looking for might be a pry bar, one of the tools that his brother, Bob Mendes, used so often at work that Bob took it with him everywhere in his portable toolkit. But it wouldn't be until 2017 when investigators from the TV series Cold Justice teamed up with the Oneida County Sheriff's Department that law enforcement was finally able to break Bob Mendes's perfect alibi. Not only did they now have the testimony of Bob's own daughters that the alibi was fabricated, they were also able to track down and interview Jody, the survivor of Bob's sexual abuse. Now a successful adult in a happy marriage, Jody had gone on to work in law enforcement and to be a voice for other victims of crime and abuse. And this time, investigators believed her testimony that she had not spoken to Bob at his home during the critical window of time when police believed Barb had been murdered. On February 6, 2018, Robin Bob Mendes was arrested in the parking lot of a Minocqua Walmart store and charged with the first-degree murder of his wife, Barbara Mendes. On July 23, 2019, Bob Mendes was sentenced to life in prison. Because he was sentenced under guidelines in force at the time of the crime, 1982, he will be eligible for parole in 2039 at the age of 91. Included in the documents that Dawn and Christy had sent to the producers of Cold Justice when they asked the show's investigators to take on the unsolved murder of their mother was the Valentine's Day letter that Barbara had written to her daughters 35 years earlier. Barb's friends and family now believe that by mid-February 1982, 6 weeks before Barb was bludgeoned to death by her husband, Barb had begun to suspect Bob of sexual abuse, and that Barb herself may have felt that dark events were about to unfold in their lives. This is the Valentine's Day message that Barb wrote to 11-year-old Christy and 13-year-old Dawn with all of that in mind. My daughters. Sometimes mothers don't always take the time to tell their daughters just how much they are loved and appreciated. Our lives can go by so fast and we will have missed so much together. So, on this Valentine's Day, I want to tell you how much I love you. You are so special to me as daughters. Have a nice Valentine's Day and every day. I love you, your mother. On July 4th, 1989, 24-year-old Patty Stallings stood on the porch of her home in Hillsborough, Missouri, which is the suburb of St. Louis. She and her husband, 27-year-old David, had recently purchased this house, which overlooked Lake Wawanoka. That night, they could actually see the local Independence Day fireworks show right from their front porch. However, instead of looking up at the fireworks, both of them were just admiring their 4-month-old son, Ryan, who cooed as Patty cradled him in her arms. A sense of gratitude washed over Patty as she locked eyes with her husband. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in just a few short years. As a teenager, she'd lived on the streets, with nothing of her own and no one to protect her. In her early 20s, she had gotten a job at a convenience store, a 7-Eleven, hoping to turn her life around. But things hadn't really changed until 3 years ago, in 1986, when she had met her future husband David, who worked as a professional plate engraver. He and Patty had clicked right away, and they got married in 1988 and were soon able to purchase this dream home, the small lake house with white trim and a nice front porch. Because of her husband, Patty was the happiest she had ever been in her entire life. As the fireworks continued to illuminate the night sky, Patty looked back down at her baby's peaceful face tucked up against her chest. But then, out of nowhere, her baby, Ryan, vomited all over Patty's shirt, way more than how much babies usually spit up. But Patty wasn't too concerned. Ryan had suffered from digestive problems since he was just 2 weeks old, and his doctors had assured her as long as he was gaining weight, he was okay. And Ryan was hitting all of his weight benchmarks, so Patty trusted he would be okay. But still, when Patty went inside to get changed, and also to change the baby, she wanted to make sure Ryan didn't appear sick. He didn't seem fussy or uncomfortable, and he smiled and cooed at her as she changed him into a fresh onesie, and so Patty figured everything must still be fine. So she finished dressing her baby, then she changed her own clothes, and then the pair went back outside to enjoy the rest of the fireworks with David. 5 days later, Patty woke up in her large, sunny bedroom feeling unusually well rested. She rolled over in bed to find the other side was empty. David had already left for work. She checked the clock on her nightstand and saw that it was almost 9 a.m. She'd slept in longer than usual. She listened for the sounds of her son crying for breakfast, but the house was silent. But Patty didn't think much of it. She was actually thankful to have such a nice, quiet, slow morning for once. Patty made her way into the kitchen, she brewed a cup of coffee, and then sat down on the couch. She spent a moment enjoying the peace and quiet, but after a few minutes passed, she started feeling uneasy. It wasn't normal for her baby to sleep this late. And so Patty tiptoed into the nursery, and she found her son lying in his crib, but he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open in a glassy stare. His lips were pressed tightly shut, and his chest rose and fell way too fast, like he was having trouble catching his breath. Patty's stomach dropped. She'd never seen her son look so sick before. She lifted his limp body out of the crib, and almost immediately, Ryan began vomiting almost uncontrollably. Patty was so scared she began shaking. Still carrying her baby, she ran into the living room. She grabbed the phone, but she didn't call 911. She lived far from the hospital and knew that waiting for an ambulance would waste time Ryan probably didn't have. She knew it would be faster just to take him to the hospital herself. So she called the St. Louis Children's Hospital and told the operator she was on her way. "10 minutes later, Patty sped down the highway towards St. Louis. She wasn't familiar with the roads, and driving in the city made her nervous. And so as cars honked and swerved around her, she tried to look down at the paper map in her lap to read it, but it was really hard to do that and also drive. As Patty turned around to check her blind spot, she caught a glimpse of Ryan in his car seat. It looked like his chest was barely moving. Afraid her son was just going to stop breathing altogether, Patty turned back around and just began looking out ahead for any highway sign that might just tell her where to go. Right up ahead, she noticed a sign that had a big H on it right near an exit ramp, and Patty knew that meant there had to be a hospital close by. So she flipped on her blinker, she got off the freeway, and followed the hospital signs towards the emergency room. It wasn't until she pulled into the parking lot of that hospital that she realized it was not the St. Louis Children's Hospital that she had called. The sign on the building that she was at said Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. But really, it didn't matter to Patty. She was just happy to be somewhere with doctors who could help her son. So she turned off her car, she jumped out, and she opened up the back door, and she reached in, and Ryan's tiny body was just so limp in his car seat. Patty unstrapped him carefully and then picked him up and held him tight to her chest. She could barely hear his shallow breathing as she ran with him inside the emergency room. Once she was inside, Patty rushed to the check-in desk and explained what was going on. A young nurse arrived quickly and ushered her and her son into the pediatric intensive care unit. The nurse then took Ryan out of Patty's arms and brought him into an examination room. Patty followed, feeling totally helpless. As Patty walked into the room, she saw her son was already being hooked up to a nasal cannula, which is like a thin tube with two prongs that are inserted into the nose. When they turned it on, it sent oxygen into Ryan's lungs, helping him breathe. Within moments, Patty could see her son's chest was now rising and falling normally, and she was so relieved. As soon as the ER doctor confirmed that yes, Ryan was stable now, Patty asked a nurse to use the hospital phone. She needed to call her husband. Later that day, Patty and her husband David sat by Ryan's bedside, watching him breathe through the tube attached to his nose. After such a frantic morning and afternoon, Patty was totally exhausted, and David, who had left work early to be there, was also very tired. And so as the anxiety of the day began to fade away, because Ryan was very stable at this point, the parents began to nod off. But before they could fall asleep, an older man in a white coat entered the room. He had graying hair and a round, reddish face. He sat down next to the parents and introduced himself as Dr. Stevens, the hospital's chief of pediatrics. Patty couldn't read the doctor's expression. It was like he'd practiced keeping his face totally neutral, most likely so he could deliver any kind of news, good or bad, with some level of professional distance. Dr. Stevens told the parents that their son, Ryan, seemed like he was going to be okay, but he really wasn't sure what had caused their son's illness. He had ordered some blood tests, but it could take days to run them all, and Ryan needed to stay in the hospital until the results were in. Until then, there was really nothing Patty or David could do, and so Dr. Stevens suggested that they go ahead and actually nod off and try to get some rest. 3 days later, on July 12th, Dr. Stevens strode down the hospital hallway, followed closely by two men wearing black suits. The doctor was totally on edge. In his long career as a pediatrician, he'd seen a lot of shocking things, but nothing like this. Dr. Stevens eventually came to a stop outside of a room where he knew Patty and David were staying. Ryan was not in the room with them. This was a room just for the parents. Dr. Stevens turned around and told the two men in suits to please wait in the hall for a second so that he, the doctor, could go in first and speak to the couple. The two men in suits nodded and stayed put, and Dr. Stevens, he took a deep breath, turned around, and then knocked on the door, but then before waiting for an answer, he just opened it up and went inside. Patty and David were sitting on the bed inside the room, looking tired, but also hopeful. Dr. Stevens immediately told them that he had good news. Their baby, Ryan, was going to be okay. Dr. Stevens watched relief wash over both parents, and then Patty asked the doctor, when could they see their son? Dr. Stevens paused. He knew what he was about to say next was going to start a very difficult conversation. He explained that Ryan's diagnosis, while not fatal, was still very serious and deeply concerning. According to lab reports, Ryan had high levels of ethylene glycol in his system, and ethylene glycol was one of the main ingredients in antifreeze. It was extremely toxic if consumed, and there was no way a baby of Ryan's age could ingest antifreeze on his own. He couldn't even crawl yet. Dr. Stevens paused to gauge Patty and David's reaction, looking for any signs of guilt or panic, but their faces were blank with confusion. So Dr. Stevens continued, being very careful to keep his tone detached as he made his meaning crystal clear. There is only one way Ryan could have antifreeze in his system, and that would be if someone deliberately fed it to him. In short, he was telling the parents that their child had been intentionally poisoned, and Patty and David were the main suspects. Dr. Stevens watched the parents closely as they finally registered what he was saying. Their eyes went wide and their mouths fell open. He half expected them to begin protesting, but they actually just didn't say anything at all. They just stood there, stunned. Then Dr. Stevens walked over to the door and rested his hand on the doorknob, and then he told the parents that, given the circumstances, he had contacted both the Missouri Division of Family Services and the police. Then Dr. Stevens opened the door to reveal the two men in suits. They were detectives with the St. Louis Police Department, and they were here to interview Patty and David. The little room fell silent as Dr. Stevens watched Patty and David stand up and follow the two detectives down the hallway towards two rooms where each parent would be interviewed separately. 9 days later, Patty stood at her son's bedside in the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Ryan smiled up at her with no breathing tubes in the way. He cooed and grabbed at the air. Patty wanted to reach down and pick him up, but she was too anxious. Two nurses stood in the corner of the room like guards, watching her every move. When the detectives had interviewed her the previous week, they'd asked her a lot of invasive questions about her marriage and her baby. They kept repeating that either she or her husband must have poisoned Ryan. The whole thing just felt like some sick joke. Patty insisted she was innocent. She had no idea how her son ended up with antifreeze in his system, but she knew she and David were not to blame. The police did eventually let them go, and they'd spent every night at the hospital since then, but still, every time Patty left her room, she could feel the staff looking at her with intense suspicion. Patty turned and made eye contact with one of the nurses standing in the corner of the room. Patty asked if she could hold her baby. The nurse hesitated and then said, "Yes, you can." Patty reached down, but before she could pick Ryan up, Dr. Stevens came into the room. Patty instinctively pulled her arms back. She'd felt like she'd been caught doing something wrong, even though all she really wanted to do was just hold her baby. Dr. Stevens came over to Ryan's bedside and took a look at him. Patty knew her son had been improving, but she was still kind of surprised when Dr. Stevens said Ryan was healthy enough to leave the hospital. Patty broke into a huge smile at this news. She'd been so confused and anxious, but now her son was healthy again. The police hadn't arrested her and her husband. It sounded like everything was going to be okay. But then she saw the doctor's expression shift. He explained that Ryan was being released from the hospital, but he was not going home with Patty and David. The police investigation was still ongoing, and until they knew more, Dr. Stevens had to release Ryan into the custody of the state. Ryan was going to be placed in foster care. Patty was stunned and heartsick. She'd assumed once Ryan got better, they'd be able to move on. But now she realized this problem was going to be much bigger and go on much longer than she'd anticipated. But more than anything else, she was just worried about some stranger taking her baby home. She had no way of knowing if the foster family would actually take good care of him. Patty wanted to scream, but looking at Dr. Stevens' face, she knew it wouldn't make any difference. So she turned away from the doctor and sat down next to Ryan's hospital bed, saying she wouldn't leave his side until she absolutely had to. 6 weeks later, Patty, David, and David's parents arrived at a state-sponsored childcare facility in St. Louis for a visit with baby Ryan. Ever since they'd left the hospital, Patty and her husband had been attending these meetings every Thursday. Patty was excited to see her son, but she was frustrated that the police investigation still was not over. As long as the police were still looking into Ryan's case, she couldn't bring him home. And so the only time she got with her son were these 1-hour-long meetings just once per week. Ryan's foster parents would drop him off at the childcare facility and then pick him up as soon as Patty and David left. To Patty, the whole situation felt ludicrous and backwards, but at the same time, she would much rather spend just an hour with her son each week than no time at all. Patty, David, and David's parents entered the building, and right away, a social worker met them at the door, and she was holding Ryan. Patty's heart leapt when she saw her son. He looked healthy, and he smiled as soon as he saw her. Patty reached out and took him from the social worker's arms and carried him down the hallway into a small playroom. The social worker followed the family inside to supervise their visit. For the next hour, Patty, David, and David's parents showered baby Ryan with attention. For Patty, it was bittersweet. They should have been doing these things at their home, not in some facility. When the hour was almost up, David's parents got up to leave. David offered to walk them to their car, and the social worker went along too. They all left the room, and Patty was suddenly alone with her son for the first time in 6 weeks. Suddenly, Ryan began crying. Patty knew he must be hungry, and his foster parents had left a bag for him, so she checked inside of it and found a bottle of formula. She took it out, cradled Ryan in her arms, and began feeding it to him. Patty gazed down at her son, who looked totally content drinking out of his bottle. She held on to hope that she would have him back home soon, and this entire situation would just be over. 3 days after the visit, Patty and David were sitting on their porch looking out across the lake when a police cruiser pulled up in front of their house. 2 officers stepped out, walked up, and announced that they had a warrant. They were there to search their home. Patty could see that her husband was about to protest, but she nudged him, basically saying, "Be quiet, let this happen." At this point, she didn't care what the police did, and the sooner they finished their investigation, the sooner they would realize the parents had done nothing and Ryan could come home. And so while the detectives searched their house, Patty and David just sat together on the porch, not really saying anything. There wasn't anything to say. They both just wanted this to be over. After about an hour, Patty heard the officer's footsteps coming towards the front door. She turned to look at them and saw that they were carrying a large paper bag with the word evidence printed on the front. Before Patty could even say anything, they told her she was under arrest. She stared at them, frozen in shock. Beside her, David stood up out of his chair. He told the officers they can't be serious. But the detectives assured him they were. They said there were a lot of things that Patty and David didn't know. That very morning, Ryan's foster parents had had to take him to the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. Once again, he was suffering from symptoms of antifreeze poisoning. When police spoke to his foster parents, they learned that Patty had been left alone with him during their last visit, and she had fed him a bottle of formula. Forensic analysts tested the bottle and found traces of antifreeze inside. Plus, the detectives had just discovered an open gallon-sized jug of antifreeze in Patty and David's basement. Patty was floored. She couldn't even process what they'd said about Ryan's bottle and the antifreeze in their basement. She was just too focused on the fact that her baby was sick again and back at the hospital. The police pulled Patty out of her seat and put handcuffs on her wrists. She heard them say she was being charged with assault with a deadly weapon. As they led her towards the police car, she craned her neck backwards and called out to her husband. She begged him to drive up to the hospital. One of them had to be with their son. Four days after his wife was arrested, David shifted in his chair in the waiting room of the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital. For the past 4 days, he'd been living in his own private hell. He couldn't sleep, he barely ate. He could only think about 2 things: his wife being locked up in a jail cell, and his son sick in the hospital. And in fact, Ryan's condition was much worse this time than it was the last time. This time, he was not getting better, and in fact, the doctors had placed him on life support. A few minutes later, Dr. Stevens walked into the room. The doctor's face, which was usually professional and emotionless, was now drawn. David asked what was going on, and Dr. Stevens couldn't help himself, and he just let out this long sigh. Then the doctor explained that despite everything the hospital had tried, his baby Ryan was not getting better. The poison had damaged his organs beyond repair, and there was no chance he would recover. Dr. Stevens told David that if he was religious, that he should think about contacting a minister to baptize his baby Ryan before it was too late. The little boy was very likely not going to make it. These words hit David like a punch. The grief was so immediately overwhelming that he could physically feel it in his chest. But the worst part was, he still didn't understand how this was even happening. David could barely speak, but he managed to whisper out that his wife really needed to be here. Then David just ran to the waiting room payphone, and after calling the jail where Patty was being held, and then also the local courthouse, David ended up talking to the judge in charge of Patty's case. And David begged the judge to please release his wife so she could at least come to the hospital and be with her child during his final moments. David assumed the judge would have at least some sympathy for their situation, so he was surprised when, without the slightest hesitation, the judge said no. He called Patty a baby killer and refused to let her anywhere near her son. At this point, David's grief turned into rage. He slammed the phone down and crumpled into his chair. In the span of only 2 months, his perfect life had fallen apart. But despite what the police and the judge said, he knew Patty was innocent. She adored their son. There had to be a better explanation for what was going on. David took a deep, shuddering breath and then turned to see Dr. Stevens standing there. In a soft voice, the doctor said they needed David's permission to disconnect Ryan from his life support machine. David asked if there was absolutely anything else they could try, but Dr. Stevens just shook his head and said no. And so, with no other options, David did give his permission. That same afternoon, David went into Ryan's room in the intensive care unit, and he choked back tears as a minister baptized his son. And then at around 5 p.m. on September 7th, 1989, David held Ryan as the doctors turned off his life support. David would sit there cradling his baby until his baby slowly passed away. A few hours later, David had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of his entire life. He had to call Patty in jail to tell her that her son was dead. When Patty heard the news, it was like the whole world just faded away. All she could hear was David's voice, explaining how he'd tried to convince the judge to let her come to the hospital, but he'd refused. David swore he'd done everything he could. He was scraping up money from relatives to hire a good lawyer. He promised he would get her out of jail as soon as he could. And then, for at least a full minute, Patty and David just stayed on the phone saying nothing to each other. As the white cinderblock walls of the jail's call center came back into focus, Patty saw the guard tap his wrist, letting her know her time was up. Patty told David she had to go, and then she hung up the phone and followed the guard out of the room, feeling totally numb. The next morning, Patty awoke to see a gruff-looking police deputy standing right outside the bars of her cell. He was there to give her even more bad news. Because her son had passed away, her charges were now being upgraded. In addition to assault with a deadly weapon, she was now being accused of first-degree murder. Patty grabbed a pillow and put it over her face. She felt like she'd been dragged into an alternate universe. She just couldn't understand how any of this could be real. The following month, in October, Patty sat on a plastic chair inside of the jail doctor's office. Across from her was a young physician who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world right now. And frankly, Patty felt the same way. She told the doctor she'd been feeling overwhelmed. Her hair was falling out, she was gaining weight, and she wasn't menstruating. At first, she just assumed that the stress of this horrible situation she was in was making her physically sick. But now, she was beginning to think it actually might be more than that. The doctor did not seem very sympathetic, but he did run a few tests, including collecting blood and urine samples. And while he waited for test results, she went back to her cell. A few hours later, the doctor came by to deliver the news. It turned out Patty was pregnant. 4 months later, in February of 1990, Patty gripped the sides of her hospital bed, her knuckles turning white from the pain of her latest contraction. When she'd gone into labor, she was transferred from the jail to a nearby emergency room. Patty was in a lot of pain from all the contractions, but mostly she was just feeling frustrated and angry because here she was, giving birth to her second child, and her husband was not even allowed to be there. And also, on top of that, she was grieving the loss of her first child. Patty could hear the labor and delivery nurse instructing her to push, and so Patty dug her fingers into the mattress and squeezed her eyes shut, and she felt like her body was going to rip open, and then suddenly she heard the sound of her baby crying. The nurse lifted up the newborn, and with a smile, she announced that it was a boy. Patty softened her grip on the bed. Still out of breath, she said that she and her husband had already decided on a name. David Jr., or DJ for short. Patty reached out for her child, and the nurse handed the baby over to her, and Patty held her newborn son tight against her chest. But her joy only lasted a few moments, because before long, the nurse gave Patty a very sympathetic expression, and then reached in and grabbed DJ, and then took DJ out of the room. Patty had known this was going to happen. She'd been told that, just like Ryan, DJ would be placed directly into state custody. Now she hadn't just lost one child, she'd lost two. Patty rolled over in her bed, sobbing. 2 weeks after giving birth to DJ, Patty sat in the jail's call center with a phone pressed against her ear. David had called to talk to her, and his voice was tight with concern. He said it was about DJ. Patty didn't think she could handle any more bad news, but she asked her husband, what was wrong. and he said DJ's foster parents had to take him to the St. Louis Children's Hospital that morning. Doctors said he was going to be okay, but he was extremely sick. At the thought of her youngest son being in the hospital, just like Ryan had been, Patty felt a knot rise in her throat. She asked David what kind of symptoms DJ had and if the doctors had diagnosed him with anything specific. And as David started listing off all of DJ's issues, Patty had an idea. She told her husband she had to go. She needed to call her lawyer before her phone time was up. David had managed to collect enough money from his family to hire an attorney for Patty. Since then, she and this lawyer had been preparing for her upcoming murder trial. And in her experience so far, the lawyer tended to be very busy and somewhat difficult to reach. Patty dialed her attorney's number. The phone rang so long she was worried he wouldn't answer, but finally he did pick up. But he sounded breathless and overwhelmed as usual. Patty knew this lawyer had a lot of cases to deal with, but for now, she really needed him to listen. Patty had a theory that she thought would prove her innocence, that she never gave Ryan antifreeze. The lawyer listened to this theory and then afterwards promised to do whatever he could. Patty thanked him and then hung up the phone. When she stood up, Patty actually felt pretty good. She was actually looking forward to her trial, which was scheduled for early 1991. It would be her chance to prove her innocence, bring DJ home, and put this horrible series of events in the past. About a year later, in early 1991, so January 31st, David sat in a quiet courtroom gallery, anxiously watching as 12 jurors re-entered the room. After 3 days of trial and 10 hours of deliberation, the jurors had finally reached a verdict on whether or not Patty was guilty of murdering her son Ryan. David tried to stay positive, but honestly, he did not feel very optimistic. The prosecution had been led by a tall, imposing man named George McElroy. He was the lead prosecutor in Jefferson County, Missouri, and he had presented an overwhelming amount of evidence against Patty. The prosecution's witnesses had testified that antifreeze had been found in Ryan's blood twice. The results were confirmed by 2 different laboratories using 2 different diagnostic methods. Plus, analysts had found traces of ethylene glycol in Ryan's bottle, and also an open container of antifreeze inside of David and Patty's house. All through the trial, David had anxiously waited for Patty's lawyer to present Patty's theory, the one she thought could prove her innocence. The lawyer had tried to make an argument for it, but he didn't call an expert witness to testify. So the judge wouldn't allow it into evidence, and the jury wasn't allowed to consider Patty's theory. David had been furious. It wasn't easy to pay for this lawyer, and now he felt like the lawyer had kind of failed and Patty's defense had been a total disaster. But there was nothing David could do now. The jurors sat down in the courtroom, and the jury foreman approached a microphone. David tapped his foot anxiously as he saw his wife at the front of the room, standing up, getting ready to hear what this foreperson had to say. Then David heard the foreman's voice through the courthouse speakers. But as the foreman read the verdict, it was like David's brain couldn't process what he was hearing. The jury had found Patty guilty of first-degree murder. After the verdict was read, David saw Patty collapse back into her chair. He couldn't see her face from his seat. All he saw were 2 policemen immediately handcuffing her and leading her out of the courtroom. David dropped his head into his hands, feeling a mixture of fury and despair. No matter what the prosecution had said, David did not have a shred of doubt about his wife's innocence. A week later, David was at home when he received a call from Patty's attorney. He was calling about Patty's sentence. She had just been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. David was crushed. He hung up the phone and started pacing back and forth across his living room, trying to think of some way he could fix this, but he just couldn't think of anything. 4 months after Patty's trial, in May of 1991, David sat in his living room alone. He looked out the window that faced their front yard, and he remembered that night, almost 2 years ago, when he and his wife were holding Ryan and watching the fireworks. Patty said she couldn't believe how much her life had changed since they had met, and David couldn't believe how much more it had changed since then. Their first child had died, their second child, DJ, was still living with a foster family, and just like when Ryan was in foster care, David was only allowed to visit DJ once a week for 1 hour. But David still hoped he could find a way to bring his family back together. David picked up the remote and turned on the TV and changed the channel to NBC. In just a few minutes, the program he was waiting for would come on. He had promised himself he would find a way to make things right again. Ever since Patty's verdict, he'd been working to get as much publicity as possible. He'd even convinced the producers of a hugely successful television show to cover Patty's story. And as the clock hit 8 p.m., the opening credits of Unsolved Mysteries, the TV show, began. David saw his wife's face on the television, followed by pictures of baby Ryan. The narrator began their story, and David leaned back in his chair. He'd done everything he could. Now he just had to hope for the best. At the same time this show was playing, across town, a geneticist and pediatrician named Dr. William Sly sat at home in his easy chair watching the same Unsolved Mysteries broadcast. As he saw pictures of baby Ryan and listened to interviews with Patty, the doctor found himself totally hooked into this story. He also thought he might be able to help David and Patty. Dr. Sly was the chairman of St. Louis University's Department of Biochemistry. When he heard Patty explain her theory of why she was innocent on the show, the same theory her lawyer did not present at her trial, Dr. Sly thought it made sense. And if Patty's theory really was true, then Patty really had been wrongly convicted. The next morning, when Dr. Sly arrived at work at his university laboratory, he pulled one of his colleagues aside, Dr. James Shoemaker, to tell him about Patty's theory. But when Dr. Shoemaker heard Patty's name, he stopped in his tracks. He said he'd heard about the case over a year ago, in April of 1990. He also thought Patty's theory sounded viable, so he'd reached out to one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood. He'd requested copies of all their lab reports, as well as any samples of Ryan's blood that they still had on hand. Back then, Dr. Shoemaker had done his own analysis, and his results didn't exactly match the ones that one of the laboratories that tested Ryan's blood had come up with. At the time, Dr. Shoemaker didn't know what to do with this information, but he still had all the paperwork in his office. Dr. Sly's heartbeat quickened. He told his colleague he needed to see those lab results right now. The two doctors raced down the hallway to Dr. Shoemaker's office. Dr. Sly anxiously looked on as his colleague rifled through a stack of papers on his desk. Dr. Shoemaker grabbed a few sheets and held them out. Dr. Sly picked up the documents and started scanning through them. And as he compared the original lab results with Dr. Shoemaker's analysis, Dr. Sly's jaw dropped. He asked Dr. Shoemaker for a piece of paper and a pen. He needed to write a letter to the county prosecutor. 4 months later, in September of 1991, County Prosecutor George McElroy stood in front of a huge crowd of reporters and a cameraman. He looked to his right and he saw Patty and David standing beside them. Both of them had totally stoic expressions on their faces. Prosecutor McElroy straightened his jacket nervously. This was the most important and most embarrassing press conference of his career. He leaned close to the microphone and announced that he'd done something unprecedented. He had asked the county circuit judge to dismiss the murder charges against Patty Stallings. He said after reading Dr. Sly's letter and consulting with another independent medical expert, he was finally convinced of Patty's theory. She'd been right all along. Baby Ryan didn't die from antifreeze poisoning. For over 2 years, Patty had been accused of poisoning her son, but she had never hurt him. Nobody had. In reality, Ryan had died from a rare genetic disorder called methylmalonic acidemia, or MMA for short, which caused his own body to produce a deadly chemical that was nearly identical to antifreeze. People with MMA can't fully digest food containing certain proteins and fats, many of which are in breast milk and baby formula. When these nutrients are not properly processed, they break down and turn into poison in the body. This causes vomiting, lethargy, trouble breathing, and organ damage. Patty had told her lawyer that she believed Ryan could have this disorder because his little brother DJ had it too. When DJ had fallen ill, his symptoms were the exact same as Ryan's, but instead of finding antifreeze in his blood, DJ's doctors had found a toxic substance called propionic acid. Propionic acid is often a telltale sign of MMA. It's also almost chemically identical to ethylene glycol, which is the poison found in antifreeze. The molecules are only different by a few carbon atoms, and so the two are easily mistaken for each other. When Dr. Sly saw Ryan's case on Unsolved Mysteries and then looked over the baby's lab results, this was the tiny discrepancy he found. The substance that analysts thought was ethylene glycol was actually propionic acid. Tragically, if Ryan had been treated at St. Louis Children's Hospital, where DJ had been correctly diagnosed and Patty was trying to take Ryan when he first got sick, all of this could have been avoided. Instead, the analysts at Cardinal Glennon and the other labs that tested Ryan's blood had unfortunately misidentified this naturally occurring substance as antifreeze, and their incorrect findings had been used to send Patty, an innocent woman, to prison for life. It is worth noting that the mix-up in going to the wrong hospital would not have necessarily saved Ryan, because MMA has an extremely high mortality rate, and long-term survival is not very likely. As prosecutor George McElroy stood before the crowd of reporters, he admitted he'd been wrong, and then he personally apologized to Patty and David. He said even though their suffering could not be undone, he would make sure Patty was fully exonerated, and she would get to bring her surviving son, DJ, back home. Patty and David filed lawsuits against the Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, the diagnostic labs who'd misdiagnosed Ryan, and 3 different physicians. In 1993, they received an out-of-court settlement for an undisclosed amount. Their surviving son, DJ, battled the same genetic disorder that killed his brother, and unfortunately, it took his life too in 2013, when he was just 23 years old.
Stretches through the treetops, painting gold along the breeze. I can hear the quiet footsteps of a message meant for me. Feather light, the echo lingers, calling softly through the air, like a whisper from the heavens only dreamers learn to bear. Every moment feels anew, the sky is breaking through.
From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis,